Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm glad we all managed to at least get indoors before any rain showers came to, we can't go several days without a good thunderstorm. So I'm glad you all could make it. I want to say a special thank you to Shacksbury Cider for sponsoring this speaking series that we're starting off, and this is the first one of today, our Talking Archaeology series. I'm Chris Sabick. I'm the Executive Director of the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. And, I've worked here for a long time now and came up through the archaeology department itself. So I'm going to be speaking on a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And also I want everyone to keep the framework in mind here that all of this research these days is kind of focused towards next year in 2026, the 250th commemoration of all this amazing activity that took place on Lake Champlain in 1776. Okay, let's get started here. First of all, I just wanted to point out this picture, which is of our replica gunboat, the Philadelphia, which you can see sitting on the lawn now. This is one of my favorite pictures. This is probably from the late 90s, I would guess, maybe early 2000s. I love this because this guy that's riding the bow gun here is now one of our board members.
Did he get some shoes?
He did finally get some shoes. He's actually quite an accomplished man himself. I'm very happy to. I always have to poke fun of him when I see this picture, though, because it makes me laugh. All right, I'm going to start off with just a quick background history of kind of the historic event itself as it took place, and then we'll go in and talk about the archaeological evidence that's been left on the lake bottom from those various parts of the events of 1776, and we'll talk a little bit about what's going on, what's happened in the past archaeologically, what's going on now, and what we're planning for in the future. So as you're probably aware, Lake Champlain is part of a historic corridor that stretches from New York City along the Hudson River through Lake George, Lake Champlain, the Richelieu River up to the St. Lawrence River. And in the 18th century, this water, nearly complete water corridor through the wilderness was really the only way to transport large amounts of men and material through this part of the world. It was certainly the most efficient way to do it. So control of these waterways has been an important component of all the military activity that took place in the northeastern United States, since European contact started here in the 17th century. Obviously, we're going to focus specifically on the role that this water corridor played during the American Revolution. And specifically, we're going to talk about what happened on Lake Champlain. And the story really starts in 1775. We've actually just about a month ago celebrated or commemorated the 250th anniversary of the capture of Fort Ticonderoga on May 10th of 1775. And that's really the starting point for our story. Benedict Arnold and the Green Mountain Boys and Benedict Arnold, depending on how you want to think about it, captured Fort Ticonderoga, and that eventually led to the capture of, once they had made a fairly easy capture of Fort Ticonderoga, a couple days later they captured Crown Point as well, and then they made their way north to St. John, where they also captured Fort St. John and a couple of vessels there that they incorporated into their navy. Lake Champlain then, in the late summer and fall of 1775, was one of the avenues of the corridors of invasion into Canada, with this attempt to convince the Canadians that maybe they should rise up against the British as well and join this rebellion. Didn't work out so great. They were able to capture Montreal and advance, I guess, downriver on the St. Lawrence to Quebec City itself, where they laid siege to the capital. Unfortunately, right at the end of the year, as the terms of service for many of the troops were about to run out on, at the end of the year of 1775, they made one last desperate attempt to capture the fortifications there in Quebec and were repulsed. And then pretty shortly thereafter, about 10,000 British reinforcements showed up in the area. And the American Army, or what was left of the American Army, beat a hasty retreat back up the St. Lawrence River and into Lake Champlain, and ultimately down to Crown Point and to Fort Ticonderoga, where they attempted to regroup. Realizing that the British were going to do the same thing that the Americans had just tried, but in reverse, right? They're going to come down the lake, try to capture the lake that's going to lead them to the headwaters of the Hudson, and allow them to go down and join with the British troops that were capturing New York City at the time. With the old idea, of course, to divide and conquer. If they're able to control this whole water corridor, they're able to, segregate the rebellious colonies from one another and then defeat them piecemeal. So in an effort to resist that, the looming invasion, the American forces, at least a good portion of them, settled back down to Skenesboro at the extreme southern end of the lake. That is now Whitehall, New York. And here they took over the town of Skenesboro, which was dominated by a gentleman named Skene, who was an active British military officer at the time. He was actually returning from London when the Americans showed up to capture or take over his enterprise there in Skenesboro. And the reason they chose this location is because Skene had established ironworks, sawmills, all kinds of that infrastructure you need to build vessels. And it was further down on that transportation corridor, so as supplies came up from Albany area, Lake George, they would get to Skenesboro first. They could put those into the fleet and then send the ships up the lake to defend the lake. So they started building vessels as quickly as possible here and adding to the small number of vessels that they had captured previously at Fort St. Jean. Initial construction efforts focused on gunboats. They started building these 54-foot long, 15-foot wide, flat-bottomed, very poor sailing vessels, armed with 3 guns. Hard to tell in this picture, but there's one gun that points out the bow. This is the one that my board member Tim was riding on in the previous picture. And then there's a gun, usually a 9-pounder, that pointed out to either side. Ultimately, they ended up building 8 of these vessels, one of which we have the replica of the Philadelphia out on the front lawn. It was great. They were easy to build. They could crank them out pretty fast. Honestly, just a pretty miserable fighting platform, though. You know, it's got 3 guns on it, but they're all pointing in different directions, which makes it not super convenient. It was only rigged with these square sails, which meant that unless this wind was directly from the stern, the combination of a crosswind and the flat bottom of the boat would just go sideways instead of going forward. So they were mostly rowed unless there was just the right wind to help them move down the lake. Eventually, our good friend Benedict Arnold was put in charge of this shipbuilding effort, and he pretty quickly realized that they needed some more substantial vessels if they were going to repel the coming British invasion. So he ordered them to start building row galleys. The row galley is a 74-foot long vessel. It's about 20 to 22 feet wide, depending on whose numbers you believe. And it is arranged more like a traditional sailing vessel in that its armament was deployed in broadside. So you have at least half your guns all pointing in the same direction, which is a good idea. It is also, these vessels were outfitted with lateen sails. So this is a primitive might not be the right word, but it's a fore and aft sailing rig, similar to like these fore and aft sails you see on the schooner Royal Savage. But this was a much handier sailing vessel for Lake Champlain waters than the gunboats were. They still weren't wonderful sailing vessels, but they had some advantages with that fore and aft sailing rig. By the time we get to the open conflict on Lake Champlain, they had built and launched 3 of these vessels, which brought the American fleet up to a total of 15 vessels. So we have 8 gunboats. We have 3 of the row galleys, and then we have a number of these smaller sloops and schooners that were captured from the British or from Philip Skene himself and incorporated into the fleet. One of these, the Enterprise, was used as the hospital ship. The Catherine was a really small vessel. It was renamed the Liberty, was used kind of as a messenger. But this was the majority of the fleet, the principal vessels being the gunboats and the rogue galleys. Though I will admit that the Royal Savage is going to figure into our story prominently as well. And at the beginning, when this fleet was assembled in the summer of 1776 and started to patrol on the lake, the Royal Savage was actually Benedict Arnold's flagship until the rogue galley Congress arrived and he transferred his flag to the Congress. Now, as the Americans were building these vessels at the southern end of the lake, the British were doing the exact same thing up at Fort St. John, where they built between 20 and 30 of their own gunboats. Their pattern of gunboat was a little more straightforward. It's just a big rowboat with one gun in the bow, which honestly makes much more sense. But they also built some much larger vessels. They brought up they partially disassembled 2 schooners that had been serving on the St. Lawrence, and they were able to drag them up through the rapids of the Richelieu River and then reassemble them once they got to Fort St. John. They also built the largest vessel of their fleet, the Inflexible. It's basically a full-size frigate, and the largest sailing vessel to operate on Lake Champlain until the War of 1812. So they built a very powerful fleet pretty quickly up there at Fort St. John, and they were able to man their fleet with Royal Navy sailors and soldiers from the St. Lawrence fleet that they brought up and put into these vessels. The Americans, on the other hand, had just a few of the captains of their vessels that had some experience on the water. The rest of the sailors were really soldiers and militiamen that were forced, encouraged onto these boats to join the Navy. These 2 fleets, after some maneuvering around, at least on the American side, a good part of the summer of 1776, Arnold spent scouting the lake. The British were still furiously building their vessels up at the northern end of the lake. Arnold spent a lot of time patrolling the lake and trying to pick the spot where he could have this battle that would give him the greatest advantage and give the British fleet the greatest disadvantage. And for that location, he chose the strait between the New York shore and Valcour Island. If you're unfamiliar with Valcour Island, it is just a couple miles south of Plattsburgh, New York these days. And Arnold arranged his fleet between the island here and the New York shore. This is obviously not to scale. It didn't quite stretch from shore to shore. This is about a mile between the island and the New York shore. But this position offered a number of real advantages. When they were tucked in here behind the island, they couldn't really be observed until you were south of the island, and then you could look back up and see them. Arnold also knew that the British were going to be coming from the north, right? They're coming from Fort St. John, which means they would have to be traveling with a southerly wind that would carry them up the lake. And in this location, the British were actually forced to sail past the island and then attempt to come back up into the wind to come to grips with the American fleet. This allowed Arnold to anchor his fleet in place and to let his soldiers and sailors really focus on their guns and manning the guns and working the guns, and not so much about working the vessel. Whereas the British were forced to, have their sailors doing both at the same time, which, being Royal Navy veterans, they could probably do pretty well anyway, but every advantage was helpful. The great advantage here was really the fact that they had to come back up into the wind. And you may have noticed the vessels like the Inflexible were also square-sailed rigs, mostly. So they don't sail well up into the wind. So the largest British vessels actually never made it up into battle. Most of them got stuck down here south of the island, and the majority of the fighting on the British side that took place on October 11th was done by their gunboat fleet and a couple of their smaller schooners, which were quite excellent sailors and could actually come up into the wind a bit. So these two forces met in combat on October 11th, with activity starting around midday, probably about 11 o'clock in the morning. The Americans were alerted. They had a watch boat out at the northern end of the island, and fired a signal gun and let the rest of the fleet know that the British were coming down from Canada. And they were a little bit impatient, I think, for the British to arrive. At some point, the Royal Savage, the small schooner, which had been the flagship, though the flag had now been transferred to the Congress, decided to come out and peek around the end of the island and see if the British were coming. I think they probably came out a little bit, and there was the Inflexible and the big schooners, and they decided they had to get back around the end of the island. They took a couple of cannon shot during that maneuvering, probably due to some poor handling as well. The Royal Savage ends up crashing on the southern tip of Valcour Island and eventually had to be abandoned, but that will factor into our story further on as well. Fighting at Valcour continued throughout the day until darkness fell, with both sides taking casualties and having vessels significantly damaged, though I would say that the Americans definitely got the worst of this situation. Right at the end of the day, the gunboat Philadelphia sank. She had taken a 24-pound cannonball right up in the bow that had stove in a plank right at the waterline, and the boat went down pretty quickly. With that big 12-pound cannon up in the bow, there's a lot of weight in the bow that definitely encouraged her to head down once it started to. But luckily, most of the crew escaped onto the rogue galley Washington, which is the starker vessel in the background, with a triangular sail. Now notice here, because this is going to factor into our story later as well, that the Washington only has one of those large triangular sails, whereas the image I showed before, the rogue galleys like this one here, have two triangular sails. The foremast of the Washington has been shot away during the course of the battle. I think this is supposed to be it floating in the lake here in this artist rendition. But that's why there's only one sail showing on the Washington in this image. Now this is about 60 Americans were killed or wounded during this fighting on the 11th. On the British side, there was one British gunboat that exploded. It's unclear if its magazine was hit by another shell, or if there was by an American shell, or if there was potentially some, poor handling of flammable materials on board. But one of their gunboats did explode and sink. The schooner Carleton, which is one of those vessels that had made it up into action, had taken a pretty severe pummeling as well, but then was able to retreat behind the gunboat line and survived to fight another day. And as darkness fell, the Americans were really in a pinch. They were now trapped in this location. There's really no great way to escape out the northern end of that strait due to some shallow water and the fact that that's the way the wind was blowing from. They were pretty low on ammunition and gunpowder. And, they really had some tough decisions ahead of them. The British settled back into a blockading position, stretching from the southern tip of Valcour Island over to the New York shore, and strung their vessels along this line to keep the Americans cordoned into the strait between Valcour and the New York shore, and figured that they would just close in and finish off the American fleet in the morning. In an incredibly daring move, the American fleet, led by Benedict Arnold, decided to sneak through this cordon, through this blockade, and escape south. And they did this in the middle of the night by lining their vessels up single file, by placing a lantern in the stern of each vessel that was shielded on three sides, so it could only be seen directly from the stern. I have a good, hopefully here, representation of that. And that allowed them to keep their fleet in line. They snuck along the New York shore, right along the edge where people were afraid they were going to be running aground. And they managed to find a gap through the British line and snuck through without being seen or heard. That seems pretty remarkable, but there's a couple of factors here I'd like to clue you into that may make this a little more believable. If you remember, the Royal Savage there piled up on the southern end of the island. And as night fell, it was decided that that vessel needed to be burned so that the Americans couldn't recapture it and turn the guns on to the British fleet. And so it was set afire and burned, ferociously, and probably provided an excellent distraction. It's mid-October in the northern end of Lake Champlain. It's probably cold, extremely dark, and you have this tremendous blazing inferno going on at the end of the island. I'm sure it was a great distraction. The other thing to keep in mind here is that the British sailors, and the Americans too for that matter, were probably mostly functionally deaf at this point. After listening to enormous cannons firing for many hours and being in close proximity to those cannons, I doubt they all had ringing ears. I guarantee it. Even in the past when we've had reenactments here and you file the little swivel guns, it's incredibly loud. And this went on for many hours during the course of the day. So between the distraction of the burning Royal Savage, the fact that they were effectively deaf, exhausted after a long day of fighting, I think all of these probably contributed to the fact that the Americans were able to make this escape. Over the course of the night of the 11th into the 12th, the Americans traveled south a few miles, stopping briefly around Schuyler's Island. And here they patched holes, they fixed their sailing and rigging, and tried to make their vessels a little more seaworthy. And it was also at this point that they determined that two of their vessels were just not going to make it. Two of the gunboats were abandoned. The first, the Jersey, was they attempted to sink. Unfortunately, it didn't go all the way down, and the British found it the next day, floating at the surface, but swamped. The other vessel, the Spitfire, was successfully sunk into deep water and wouldn't be seen again for more than 200 years. We'll talk about that in a minute. And once they had, recovered the crews from these two vessels, and fixed what they could on the remaining vessels, the rest of the fleet headed south once again. And on the 13th, wind continued to be out of the north. The wind now had shifted to coming out of the south, so the Americans were escaping into the wind, which meant they were rowing, which meant they were enormously exhausted at this point. But the British were also heading into the wind, and therefore the progress of the two fleets, the British woke up the next morning on the 12th and realized that the Americans had escaped. They were able to still see their topsails way to the south, and they set off in pursuit as fast as they could against the contrary winds. And the day of the 12th was spent with these two fleets several miles apart, but just both migrating south as quickly as they could. On the 13th, the morning of the 13th is when things started to get really interesting. Are the Connecticut, the Providence, the Boston, and New Haven? I'm going to forget now. But they were left behind, and as the day lengthened on the 13th, the wind shifted back to the north. And now that breeze, it got to the British fleet first. And all of a sudden, the Americans looking back could see that they were making up the distance very quickly because the wind hadn't gotten to the American fleet yet. So as the British were bearing down on them, the Americans are rowing furiously. Eventually, the wind does get to the Americans, but it comes along with the British. And the British now are surrounding the ragtag, stump of this fleet, and the fighting gets very vicious. And here's where the better quality ships, the better quality sailors, really paid off on the British side. The Americans who were attempting to flee and work their guns at the same time were really struggling to put up much of a resistance here. And the first American vessel to fall was the rogue galley Washington, which, as we pointed out before, had lost a mast, had been severely damaged in the fighting at Valcour Bay, to the point where its commander was afraid to even fire his own guns in response because he was afraid his boat would fall apart. So he actually sent a messenger on a small boat over to Arnold and said, you know, I'd like to abandon my vessel, I'd like to run it up on shore and burn it to deny its capture. And Arnold sent back the message, you know, that sounds really easy, but we're talking about people having to get into a boat, row several miles, talk, row back. He said, under no circumstances will you abandon your vessel and destroy your vessel. And commander of the Washington was kind of flabbergasted by this because he had no way to resist. And when the British did close down and fire a couple of warning shots across his bow, he had to strike his colors and surrender his vessel. I did mention the tremendous amount of defensive troops that the Americans had positioned at those two locations, and Carleton lost his nerve and decided, you know, I'll come back next year and finish this. So he actually pulled the troops out of Crown Point, and they retreated back up to Fort St. John for the winter. And then they, you know, with the idea that they would pick this all up again in 1777, which they did, but that's another story. As we start to talk about the archaeological evidence of this happening, we've got to start back where our story started at the Battle of Valcour Island itself. And I'd like to focus first on the Royal Savage, this boat that was burned at the southern end of the island. This, again, is a small British-built sloop that was built at Fort St. John, but then was captured by the Americans as they moved north towards invading Canada. It was one of the better sailing vessels of the American fleet, other than when it ran up on the rocks, apparently. But after it was burned and sank, it never really went out of public consciousness. It was burned in shallow water. It was probably visible from time to time in clear water events. And throughout the 19th century, we have a lot of newspaper accounts of people recovering artifacts or timbers, you know, just random pieces of material that they found at the Royal Savage site. But it wasn't until 1934 that somebody really made an effort to raise and recover what was left of the Royal Savage. And that was done by a gentleman named Lorenzo Haglund, who's going to feature prominently in our story from here forward. Haglund was a Navy diver. He was also a salvage. He was a guy that was involved in salvaging sunken vessels. And while vacationing in upstate New York, he learned about the naval history of Lake Champlain, and he became really interested in trying to find and locate some of these vessels that were lost at the Battle of Valcour Island. And the first one that he focused his attention on was the Royal Savage. So in 1934, in collaboration with some other local divers, he was able to locate the wreck, and they literally winched it. They used some empty oil drums that they used as flotation devices. So they sunk them, they attached them to the hull, and then they pumped the water out of those barrels and filled them with air. And they lifted the remains of the Royal Savage out of the mud, and then they winched it ashore. And here you can actually see, this is Haglund sitting on the remains after they were pulled ashore, and he's sketching something in his notebook. They weren't sure what to do. Now they had this thing, they weren't sure what to do with it. So they actually disassembled it, and I think this image is during the process of disassembly. Some of the planking's already gone. But they actually took it apart to its constituent parts and then stored it under the porch at the house they were staying in Plattsburgh for a number of years. The story of this wreck is really quite fascinating. It stayed in the Haglund family until after Lorenzo had died. His son had possession of it, his son Hudson Haglund. And ultimately, he sold it to a museum. Well, he sold it to the city of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The mayor of which had this designs on making a museum about, strangely, I think it was about Western history, U.S. Western history. I don't know why you would build that in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, or why you would want a gunboat from the American Revolution there. But they bought it, and so all the timbers and the associated artifacts were shipped down to Harrisburg. the mayor got voted out, and all of the timbers and material got stored in a city maintenance shed for many decades, and just sat there and sat there. In 2014, the city of Harrisburg decided we should recoup some of that money that we spent on this pile of wood, and they went to auction it. They went to auction off this amazing relic, and Maritime Museum, Fort Ticonderoga, a bunch of people caught wind of this, and we really encouraged the Navy to step in and claim this piece of American history. And I think initially the city of Harrisburg was a little resistant to that idea. They were really hoping to recoup some of that money, and then the JAG lawyer showed up and said, you really should just give that back to the Navy. And they said, sure, that's exactly what we're going to do. And they handed it right over. And in addition to all these timbers, they also handed over about 1,600 artifacts that came along with it. A bunch of really remarkable stuff here. This is a little wooden canteen that's kind of built like a barrel. It's got little staves. Two beautiful boarding axes, all kinds of shot and little pieces of hardware there. Lots of fasteners, tools, bayonets. Just a remarkable collection of material that came along with this, with the remains. Now the timbers, though they had been, just dumped unceremoniously in this maintenance shed for many years, were actually in decent condition. And once the Navy got them back to the Navy Yard in DC, they have been 3D scanning every timber, and then digitally reassembling the vessel. At the same time, they're conserving all these artifacts as well as the timbers themselves. And ultimately, they hope to reassemble the remains of the Royal Savage and put it into the new Museum of the U.S. Navy that they're building just off of the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. So kind of a happy ending there. I sure wish it was here in the Champlain Valley where we could share it, but we have an excellent working relationship with the Navy, and we're sharing information and artifacts all the time. We are a Navy repository, so I am hopeful that at some point some of this material might come up here for exhibit in the future. The next archaeology that took place on Lake Champlain, once again focused on our good friend Lorenzo Haglund and his recovery of the gunboat Philadelphia. This is just 1 year after the recovery of the Royal Savage. He located the Philadelphia where it sank after getting hit by that 24-pound cannonball. Used very much the same technology of the oil drums to help float this and then lift it to the surface. And you can see it's virtually intact. It was found, all 3 guns were found on board. They were tipped over and kind of spilled about the inside of the boat, but they were all present. One of them still loaded. The bow gun actually had a bar shot hanging out of the muzzle of the bow gun. And it also had a tremendous amount of artifacts inside. Haglund cleaned up the boat, brought all the artifacts ashore. He was constantly trying to find a place to display this vessel. He really wanted it to find a home. And he reached out to everybody that you can imagine to try to recruit someplace to take this boat from him, or at least to let him display it there. For a while, he even had it on a barge that floated around the Champlain Valley and even down the Hudson, displaying this amazing artifact. And it wasn't, unfortunately, until he passed away that the Smithsonian Institution decided to accept this piece into their collection. And it is now on display at the National Museum of American History in the Smithsonian system down there in Washington, D.C. As a side note here, it is about to undergo a very significant reconservation effort. This was never treated when it was raised. It's very shrunken. It's very delicate, and a team from Texas A&M University is working on a whole new conservation plan for this vessel, which they hope to conduct in place in the display in the Smithsonian, so that people will be able to observe what's going on with the conservation while it's happening. Very cool stuff. And when they brought it into the Smithsonian, they took a very detailed set of plans about the vessel's construction, And that's that set of plans that we used to build the replica that's out on the lawn here today. And to put a bow on that, that replica was launched in 1991, sailed around the Champlain Valley for a couple of years, was an on-water display here at the museum for many more years, and finally sank at its mooring one winter over in Basin Harbor, 2021, I believe. Honestly, our insurance company said, maybe you should just use that as a static display instead of putting it back on the lawn. So that's it's on the lawn for now. We're looking at getting it under a shelter, and we have some plans for that in the future. Moving on, also at Valcour Island, for many years people dove at Valcour Island as a place to go and just collect cannonballs and find random bits of history, and we had honestly come to the assumption that Valcour Bay itself was pretty well cleaned out. There wasn't anything visible, that's for sure. We had done some diving there and not found anything, but this gentleman, Ed Skolin, a New York State police diver, was diving in Valcour Bay doing some training with a new metal detector that he had, and he found the muzzle of a cannon. And he very presciently reported this to Art Cohn, the director of the Maritime Museum at the time, and to the New York State Museum. And this discovery, this unexpected discovery of this exploded cannon muzzle, led to the development of the Valcour Bay Research Project, which was a 6-year effort to map the bottom of Valcour Bay and see what else we could find down there. So that involved separating, kind of dividing the bottom of the lake into 50-foot squares, right? And our 0 point here, right at the cross point here, that's where that cannon muzzle was found. So that was our 0 point. And then we established this grid system off of that 0 point. Each of these grids was then very methodically metal detected by breaking it down into 3-foot wide lanes that overlapped a little bit, and so you metal detected up and down the line very thoroughly to ensure that you had thorough coverage of the area. And after covering nearly 200,000 square feet of the bottom of the lake, we had recovered several hundred artifacts, which again we were totally surprised at the amount of material that was still there. But you can see that's actually a really small part of this area. We would guesstimate this is probably 25% of the American battle line. So there is still a tremendous amount of bottom to look at out there, where there's bound to be more interesting discoveries to be made. But what we did find included a tremendous amount of cannon ammunition, of a variety of sizes. We have all kinds of solid shot, regular cannonballs like you see here, grape shot, canister shot, as well as very interesting things like bar shot. This was designed to tear the sails and rigging out of enemy ships. And surprisingly, we even found a few exploding shells, which is not something you typically find at naval battle sites. But some of the British gunboats, some of those small boats that had just a single gun in them, were actually armed with howitzers. They had, and the howitzer men were just put onto a boat and told to man their equipment and fight the American Navy, and that's why we find some remnants of exploding shells on the American line. Lots of personal armaments as well, like this belt axe, bayonet, a cartridge box. This is the ammunition pouch of a Revolutionary War soldier. The remains of a small sword. These are all individually quite interesting artifacts. But what I find really fascinating, and this is going to be a recurring theme for this discussion, is that they're all old, even at the time of 1776. This belt axe probably dates to more like 1740, as does the bayonet. The sword is maybe not that old, but it's very ramshackle. This is like a belt clip that you would for hanging on your belt, but it's just held on with a bunch of wire. Somebody just wrapped a big twist tie around it because they obviously didn't have a fully functional scabbard for their sword. But we see this a lot with the American, artifacts that we can attribute to the American fleet, is that they're old, they're decrepit, they're not standard military issue. This is representative of guys that were bringing whatever they had from home to fight this battle. They weren't issued this en masse like regular military units would. And quite remarkably, in addition to the exploded cannon muzzle, we actually found 5 more pieces of the same exploded cannon, scattered over about 200 square feet of the battlefield site. So we can now reconstruct all except for one piece of this cannon that's about this big. We're missing the trunnion on the left side and a strip of metal behind it. But otherwise, we can reassemble this whole piece. Through some historic research, we were able to determine this was a 6-pound cannon. We were also able to determine that only one of the gunboats in the American fleet, the gunboat New York, was equipped with 6-pound cannon. That led us led researchers to researching the crew of the gunboat New York, and they found a pension record of a sailor that was on board who mentioned that he was wounded by an exploding cannon on the gunboat New York, which also killed the lieutenant of the vessel, a gentleman named Lieutenant Thomas Rogers, who was from Westfield, Massachusetts. And in doing some research in Westfield, this memorial stone was discovered. And it reads, "This monument is erected to the memory of Lieutenant Thomas Rogers by Miss Molly, his sorrowful widow. He was killed by the splitting of a cannon on Lake Champlain, October 11th, 1776. That is remarkable. It's very unusual in archaeology for you to be able to attach an artifact to a very specific moment in time, and then to be able to attach it to very specific people and how it affected their lives. And what I love about this piece is, of course, it's really interesting to learn about Thomas Rogers, but here you see the impact on the home front. You see the impact that this is having on his family. His wife was pregnant at the time with their second child. Just a tragic event in their life that was taking place hundreds of miles away on Lake Champlain. Moving to day 2 of our Battle of Lake Champlain excursion, we have the gunboat Spitfire, which is the one I mentioned was sunk somewhere around Schuyler Island, sank into deep water. This is the one that was successfully sunk. And it was relocated in 1997, sitting in very deep water during the Lake Champlain Cultural Resources Survey. This was an effort to map the entire bottom of Lake Champlain using side-scan sonar. And this is the sonar image that was discovered in June of 1997. Has a very distinct gunboat shape, you can see compared to this drawing here. And you can even see in the sonar image, this is the bow gun sticking out the front of the boat. It was later verified by divers to be an American gunboat. There is only one gun in place on the Spitfire. The bow gun is in place, both the waist guns are missing. Where are they? Who knows? Our guess is that they were probably dumped overboard in an effort to keep the boat afloat as long as possible. Also possible that they were transferred onto one of those other vessels before they continued their escape southward. But the boat we've been monitoring it since its discovery and basically planning for what we can possibly do to preserve this incredible piece of history that resides in the deep water of Lake Champlain. And we've been doing some work on it over the last couple of years. In 2022, we brought a team together to collect photogrammetry data, which is the process of collecting thousands of images of an underwater object that we can then run through a computer program and turn that into a 3-dimensional model. And since this vessel sits in very deep water, we chose to do that with a remote operated vehicle, this is a chasing M2 underwater drone, it's called. This is, it's not a super high-tech piece of equipment. It's very cool and very maneuverable. It's about a $3,500 piece of equipment. But onto that, we added a bunch of dive lights and 2 GoPro cameras that were set in time-lapse mode. We sent them down to the wreck, and they very thoroughly documented the vessel. And we ended up capturing 30,000 individual photographs of this vessel. Oh, I do have this short video clip. I'll just play this while I continue to talk here. Here we had 2 ROVs, so one of them is filming the other one as it works here. And this gives you an idea of just how murky and dark it is down there. This vessel sits in water well beyond the recreational dive limits. So it's really deep, it's really dark, it's really cold, but it's also very stable, and that's one of the reasons the vessel is so well preserved. With all those images, we were then able to create this quite remarkable 3-dimensional model of the vessel itself. And again, I just want to point out the bow gun here sitting in place. The mast is still standing. I mean, that's ridiculous. There are some visible artifacts inside the vessel. Not a tremendous amount. It is completely filled with silt, so undoubtedly there's a lot more stuff inside. But just an incredible piece of piece of history that's saved on the bottom of the lake. So the next step in our process has been to assemble an advisory council of experts to discuss, to create the research design for how we might archaeologically examine the Spitfire. And that's something that took place in 2023 and 2024. And with that team, we were able to assemble a very thorough research design and define our methodologies for examining this vessel. We are currently trying to, the eternal struggle of raising some funding for this research, which has suddenly become much more difficult in our current political situation. And many of our granting agencies are, some of them no longer exist, and some of them are operating on much reduced funding, so we'll see how that process works out. We're very excited that we have decided to partner with the U.S. Navy History and Heritage Command, who are going to be co-principal investigators in this examination of the Spitfire. The vessel still technically belongs to the U.S. Navy, so it's good to have those people involved with it as we can. And we hope to start doing some limited excavation and documentation in 2026 on the 250th anniversary of this vessel's sinking. Actually, the anniversary of its construction and sinking. And that brings us to day 3 of our Battle of Lake Champlain, and that brings us to Arnold's Bay. This is an image from the bluff at the back of Arnold's Bay. This is obviously the shoreline here, and it's about a 25 or 30 foot bluff up to the farm fields that surround Arnold's Bay. The Ferris's homestead, that little cabin I was talking about, is actually just out of frame off to the left here. And the American fleet seems to have been pulled into this area here where it was burned and destroyed. Again, we have these wonderful images. Oh, here's Tim again. We had a picture of you, Tim, riding the cannon at the beginning of this presentation. So they escaped, the Americans ran their boats ashore, they escaped onto land and fled south to Crown Point. Now again, these vessels never really, they were in shallow water, they were burned down to the water line, but they were visible. Certainly from time to time they were visible in low water events and when the water was clear. And again, we have this whole series of stories of people recovering artifacts and pieces of these boats, including the stern of the Roe Galley Congress. This is the back end, about 30 feet of the Roe Galley Congress that was pulled out of the lake in 1892 and displayed here on the shoreline in Arnold's. So Ferris's Bay ultimately became known as Arnold's Bay as it is today, obviously for the events that took place there that Arnold was involved in. And it sat there on the shoreline for a number of years. Ultimately got transferred down to the Chimney Point Historic Site, or what's now the Chimney Point Historic Site, which was a hotel at the time. Unfortunately, there it rotted away and is lost to us. Yeah. We have 2 of the floors, these curved timbers here that you might think of as ribs. 2 of those were saved and are in our Revolutionary War display at this point, but all the rest of the structure is lost. We have, like I said, about 30 feet of the keel of the vessels here. This is the stern deadwood. which would have gone up to the transom of the boat. Luckily, we have this picture of the remains, and we have a picture that I imagine was taken on the same day from the other side. So we have these, both sides of this structure fairly well documented. There are a couple pictures of it rotting away behind the Chimney Point Hotel, but that's all we have left of that boat, fortunately. At the mouth of the bay in the 1930s, a gentleman was diving in his homemade diving suit. He actually had a box with a pane of glass embedded in it that he could look through. Had a hose attached to it, had his wife pumping air down to him as he stomped around on the bottom of Arnold's Bay. Obviously a very committed relationship there. He found this small cannon there and recovered it. I think this might have also been 1934 for some reason. It was right in that ballpark. And that was displayed in front of his cabin down at Basin Harbor for a number of years. And ultimately, it has also made it into our collection here at the Maritime Museum. We have news reports of 3 of the gunboats. Remember, this is the rogue alley and 4 of the gunboats that were burned here. 3 of the gunboats were pulled out of the water over the course of the 19th century and are just lost to us. There is some evidence that maybe the Ferrises might have recovered one of these gunboats themselves and used it as a ferry or just as a conveyance around the bay, but nothing left of those, unfortunately. Maybe a couple pieces of wood. So that left half of the Congress and 1 of the gunboats still in place. And that gunboat wasn't recovered until 1952 by, once again, our good friend Lorenzo Hagland decided that he needed another gunboat. They came down to recover this one. You can see he used his oil drum technique once again. Also utilized the Lake Champlain Transportation Company's small vessel, the Juniper, which then ended up being a cruise boat up in Plattsburgh, if anybody is familiar with that. Frank Papp's famous booze cruise vessel. But they raised what we call the 1952 gunboat. He was hoping to put this into a museum at the mouth of the Ausable River on the New York shore. So he took it over into Willsboro Bay, actually re-sunk it for a couple of years while he tried to figure out if this museum was going to happen. Eventually he did bring it up on shore, and unfortunately the museum never materialized. The boat rotted away. Here you can see it all overgrown and starting to fall apart. It eventually was bulldozed and destroyed. And this location now is where the KOA campground is at the Sabick Chasm. Now, we do have some great photographs. We have some pieces of this boat. One of our longtime researchers that's been associated with the museum actually visited this site when he was in his 20s, did some preliminary documentation of it. But once again, the hazards of raising a vessel without a plan in place and the proper techniques to preserve it, this is the kind of thing that happens, unfortunately. So now all the gunboats are gone. We have part of the Congress is left in the lake. In the 1960s, a group of avocational archaeologists came to the Congress site. They were able to relocate the remains of the Congress, and they used a hydraulic dredge to clean the mud off of the structure that they found. And they found, again, a tremendous number of artifacts here. Thankfully, these have also made it into the Maritime Museum's collection. They found parts of an exploding shell, again, probably fired by the British at the Congress, and this is the remains of the shell that burst. Some nice pieces of glass, an onion-shaped bottle, little medicine vial, some shipbuilding tools, nice adze, cold chisel, big iron rods. These are some components of armaments. This is a part of a musket trigger guard. This is part of the hand guard from a small sword. And these two are bayonet scabbard belt hooks. This is very similar to that belt clip I was talking about with the sword. These These were built into the leather of the scabbard for your bayonet, and then it fit onto your harness with this little clip, which we find quite a few of, quite remarkably. In the 1980s, that big bluff at the back of the bay, it was really eroding pretty badly, and it was carrying the Ferris's cabin into the lake with it. The foundation of that cabin was found at this location here where the arrow is pointing, but it was starting to tumble down the cliff into the lake. And so in collaboration with David Starbuck, a well-known archaeologist from the Albany area, came up to excavate what was left of the foundation hole of the Ferris's cabin, and again recovered quite a few artifacts, both related to the homestead, to the farming activities, and quite remarkably a few pieces of iron shot. In 2001, the Maritime Museum carried out a survey of the bottom of Arnold's Bay, and we relocated the Congress. Right? There it is. Can't you see it? This random hunk of wood sticking out of the mud. But around this plank that's sticking out of the mud, there's actually a couple more that are partially visible here. And then a little bit inshore of this, there's just a couple of tips of frames that are sticking up out of the mud. So that was the extent of the survey that year. We were able to locate it here. This is where the Congress remains are to this day. This is where the Ferris's cabin was. That initial picture I showed of the bay, you were probably standing in this location. So just to give you a little bit of the lay of the land there. Now, when we applied for and received some grant funding in 2021 to go back and do a more extensive survey of Arnold's Bay. This is, we based our search off of the maps that were generated in 2001. Again, Ferris Homestead, this is where the Congress remains are. And we actually went back and found that plank sticking out of the mud. There it is. It's the same one. And here you can see a little bit better. This is after I cleaned it off a little bit. A couple more hull planks and actually a couple of frame timbers visible. Some of the interior planking, which is known as ceiling planking, also appeared there. Just offshore of this, there's a large pile of ballast stones that certainly are indicative of a shipwreck site, though their location is a little odd, but we'll hopefully talk about that in a few minutes, if I don't keep you guys too long. So this let us know we are in the right location. The grant funding we had from the American Battlefield Protection Program, which is a National Park Service funding stream, also allowed us to do a thorough metal detecting survey of Arnold's Bay in water, on the shoreline, and of the farm fields around the bay itself. So we had a group from the Advanced Metal Detecting for the Archaeology organization come and join us. We put on basically a 3-day workshop where we had 25 students who conducted archaeological survey using metal detectors. These are the areas on shore that we surveyed inside these pink boxes, and then all along the shoreline in this yellow box. And we recovered, again, quite a few really interesting artifacts. We have both lead shot and iron shot. So this is a musket ball. This would be more like a canister or a grape shot fired from a cannon. This is another one of those bayonet scabbard belt hooks, part of a shoe buckle. I don't know what that is. That's just a folded up button, I think. And this is what's sometimes referred to as a flint wrapper or a jaws pad. This is what would have held the flint in a flintlock musket. It was used to make sure you got a good grip on your flint in your musket. Now, in addition to that shoreline survey and the field survey, we did some in-water surveying as well, and this extended into 2022. We set up these long transects, and then we metal detected along them using underwater metal detectors. And I got to tell you, we expected to find artifacts, but what we found was just ridiculous. We found so many artifacts. Each of these pins is an artifact that we located during the survey. And they're all broken down by different colors. All the pink ones are iron fasteners, nails, bolts. All the light green ones are musket balls. The red ones are iron shot. So, you know, and one thing I want to draw your attention to is this stupid pile of musket balls right here. Right in this one, you know, probably 30-foot section of Transect 5, we found more than 100 musket balls all in this one location. And, you know, what we had really hoped to find was, certainly we expected to find stuff around the Congress remains, which is this yellow box. But we were hoping we would find then, you know, a separation, and then maybe, oh, maybe there's another cluster of artifacts here, and that indicates where one of those gunboats was burned. Oh, look, here's another cluster of artifacts. Maybe that's where another gunboat burned. But we just found artifacts everywhere. There was no clear delineation, no separation between these. Obviously, it peters out a little bit as you got further south here, but there was no obvious distinction between different wreck sites. So that was, you know, we found too much stuff, but that's hard to complain about. You know, we found things like 6-pound cannonball. One of the really exciting finds was this. This is an inkwell, which actually has a glass. There's a glass bottle inside this brass casing. You know, undoubtedly this comes from an officer's kit. Your everyday soldier or sailor would not be carrying around their own inkwell. Other things that we found during the metal detector survey included this bayonet, which the socket was lost for it, but a nice blade there. Again, this is probably a 1740s, 1750s bayonet, which is interesting. And this is the handle from a pewter spoon. And what I'd like to draw your attention to is that somebody's carved their initials in the handle, which is, again, gives you that kind of really personal touch when you encounter artifacts like that. Now, this whole time we're working in Arnold's Bay under a Vermont State archaeological permit to survey the bottomlands of Arnold's Bay. We're also waiting for our permit to come from the Navy so we can actually look at the Congress. Yeah. And that took forever. And that permit wasn't issued to us until September of 2022. So late in the season, we finally received this permit. We decided we're going to do 1 week of digging on the Congress remains and just see what we can find that year. So we took a crew out there working off a pontoon boat with our handy inflatable vessel, where we established 2 hydraulic dredges that are powered by these Honda pumps you see here in the inflatable. This gives you a good idea of the water clarity in 2022, because you'll never see water that clear again, since at least not in Arnold's Bay. But you know, from the surface, we're talking about 8 or 9 feet of water here, so it's not particularly deep. But we could actually watch the divers working from the surface. You know, what we had found in Arnold's Bay, again, was there was just these little frame tips sticking up above the mud. So this is what we assumed we would find when we started diving. We assumed we'd start on, you know, on the port side of the vessel, and we'd dig down and follow this timber across. And then eventually we'd come across the center line of the vessel, where the keel and the keel sonar, and then eventually we'd work our way back up to this other frame tip on the starboard side. Makes sense? This is what every other shipwreck I've worked on looks like when you dig it up. But no, this is what we actually excavated. This is a 3-dimensional model of the trench we created in 2022. And notice there's none of those center line timbers are in the middle of this wreckage like we anticipated. So what are we looking at here? It wasn't until we started digging down further on this end of the vessel that we actually encountered the keel right here, on the extreme left side of this image. Number 1 here is the keel. So what that means is that we have a much larger section of just the starboard side of the vessel. This boat was not only burned, but reportedly it also exploded as it was, as it was burning. So quite possibly it was during that explosion that it was ripped in half, and we're looking at just the starboard side of the vessel. So what we had sticking out of the mud were, this frame tip and these little guys sticking out of the mud before we started digging. But they're from the same side, rather ironically. But while that was surprising, it's also hugely beneficial because we now have way more of the starboard side. We would have had just a little bit of both sides, but now we have way more of the starboard side Again, we have some of the internal planking, the ceiling plankings preserved. We exposed 2 floors that are attached to the keel, and then one of the futtocks that's between those 2 floors. Found a number of artifacts during this, but remember, this is also the portion of the site that had been excavated in the 1960s. So most of the big artifacts were gone. We found some shot, we found some buttons, we found some little pieces of bone, animal bones. But it was really exciting to find the keel here on the left side of our site. And as we dug down even further, there is some evidence that there's some timbers here on the port side as well, because we have the keel, we have a hull plank, there's also a ceiling plank that's kind of in this pile of muck here in this image. So that led us to 2023, when we wanted to come back and really do the excavation proper of the Congress. Does anybody remember what happened in the summer of 2023? Just a little bit of rain, a little bit of runoff. So that visibility we had in 2022, no thanks. But this was our plan, right? This is the trench we had excavated. We had hoped to follow the keel in either direction, and then once that ran out, we wanted to dig a trench at either end of the vessel, the remains. We wanted to explore the ballast pile. There's one here off to the stern. That's the one I showed you the image of before. There's also this large ballast pile that's just north of the wreckage that we were excavating. And what we learned from the folks that did the excavation in the 60s is that they encountered this ballast pile, they found those same frame tips, and as they started to dig, they just took all the rocks that they found here and they put them over there. So this is a double thick ballast pile over here. We assembled this. I promise this is the best picture of this crew that I could find. This is our archaeology team here at the museum, as well as some volunteers and interns. I'm very proud of the fact that every person in this image was once an intern at the Maritime Museum, including myself. This is my graduate school roommate who came up just to do this dig with us. And all the rest here, Paul, Cher, Patricia, and Taylor, are all now employees of the museum. So we assembled a really amazing team, and they're continuing to do great work these days. So 2023, we bring back our dredges. Note the water. It's not nearly as pretty. But we were able to uncover a lot of wreckage and recover quite a few artifacts. Part of the dredging process, we put a catch bag on the back of the spoil end of our pipe. So as you're hoovering up all this mud, it's carrying it away and spewing it out further out into the bay. But we put this bag on the back, this very fine mesh bag on the back of that spoil tube, so that if you accidentally suck anything up, it gets caught in the bag. And at the end of your dive, you go and recover your spoil bag, you bring it up to the surface, you dump it out into this kiddie pool, and then you sift through it and see what you can find. And most of what you find is zebra mussel shells, wood fragments, weird worms and bugs. And here's an image of Cher just having way too much fun sorting the filth. But we did find a lot of other really great things as well. Here we have another piece of lead shot, a kind of a random piece of broken brass or bronze. I'm not sure what that is. Some more buttons, and then this amazingly well-preserved shoe. Wow. And this was way up in where we believe the bow of the Congress is. And actually, hopefully later this week, we're going to have some experts up from Fort Ty to give us an evaluation of this shoe. But definitely an 18th century shoe. This also, again, makes me think about those poor guys marching all the way down to Crown Point. Some of them without their shoes, obviously. So, just amazing human connection through these ordinary artifacts. And that's where I see the real power of archaeology in this regard is, we're not learning more about Benedict Arnold and Guy Carleton and all these great men of history. We're learning about the average people that lived through these events and their shoes and their buttons. These are where the real connection's made for those people that haven't left us a large written documentation. Perhaps my favorite artifact find from this year, or from 2023, is and mostly because I actually found it this time, is this glass button insert. It's tiny, smaller than a dime. I saw this random thing underwater, and I picked it up and I stuffed it into my glove. I wrote down where I found it, and I went back to digging. And I brought it up later, and I handed it off to the folks on the boat, not even realizing what it was. But as you can see, it's clear glass, it's heavily stained. But in the right light, you can see it's actually embossed with a ship in the button. And that's quite remarkable, very exciting. I have not seen another historic example of a glass button insert that has this motif stamped into it. And here's what we were able to uncover of the Congress remains in 2023. This again is the keel down here. This is where that initial trench we uncovered was. So we expanded that trench. This is going offshore or west. This is going inshore or east. We uncovered a lot more frames, a lot more of the ceiling planking and the outer hull planking. Again, remember this is 2023, so when you were diving, you got to see about this much. So it wasn't until we were able to make this three-dimensional model that we were actually able to see the entire site as we were excavating it. We didn't get quite as much done as I had hoped. I really wanted to uncover this portion and uncover this back portion here, continue following the trench forward. The terrible weather, terrible visibility, and a number of other factors meant that this is what we were able to achieve in 2023, which is still great, but you always want to do more. But from this fragment, this is about 24 feet in length and about 12 feet, I think, from the keel to the outboard edge there. So not an insignificant fragment of this vessel. We were able to extract some shape information from these remains in addition to documenting the structure. And then we were able to take that shape information and compare it to the lines drawing that was created by the British Royal Navy in 1776 of the Rogue Galley Washington. Right? This is the vessel they had captured at the beginning of the running gun battle. The British are meticulous of making lines drawings of vessels they capture in case it's something they want to replicate. So we were able to acquire this lines drawing from the Royal Navy Museum in Greenwich, England. And in comparing the shape of the timbers that we found with the body plan of the Washington, we were able to determine that this is the fragment of the vessel that we were looking at. It's way up in the bow, and it's the starboard side. And that's really interesting. Now, also recall that the back 30 feet of the boat have already been pulled out and have rotted away. So we have, we have a good sized chunk of what's left of the starboard side of this vessel. But we're also really intrigued about what we can do here in the future. We recently just got some news from the Navy that they're going to come up this summer and do some work with us in Arnold's Bay, continuing to look at Congress. I'm hoping that we can at least uncover those portions of the wreck site that I pointed out before that we didn't get to in 2023. But I'm also really curious about examining the giant ballast pile to the left, north of our Congress remains. As I hypothesized that as those folks in 1960 were taking the ballast pile out of here, they were just putting it on top of the ballast pile. That was built by Army guys. So there's this kind of tension between the Navy and the Army about.
But having said that, the Navy is the one who says that you have a permit to go to this site.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Oh yeah. No. There's definitely hypocrisy going on there.
Okay.
The other part that's really galling about that is the remains of the War of 1812 vessel, the Ticonderoga, are there on the waterfront in Whitehall, and they're rotting away. They're in deplorable condition. The town of Whitehall, which is severely depressed, only does what it can with these remains. But the Navy's not interested in doing anything with them. The Canal Corps, whose property they actually sit on, is not interested in doing anything with them. you know, there's just no, I don't know, there's no synergy.
Why do you think that's true? Is in general, not that you know necessarily.
Yeah, you know, the reason that we can't find funding to work on the Ticonderoga remains are because they've been pulled out of their original location. They were recovered from the Poultney River in the 1950s and put on display here.
Yeah.
And since they've been taken out of their context, nobody wants to give us money to work on those pieces, which is frustrating. Other than that, I don't know really what to tell you.
How about just have some nice renovated signs?
Some nice
That
signs.
look clean, you know?
I mean, I would have loved to have seen what Whitehall was like in the 1890s, you know, when the canal was still really bustling. Apparently it was quite a happening place.
Yeah.
And then when the canal kind of petered out and the iron industry up north kind of petered out, you know, now it's a sad little town.
Yeah.
If you drive through downtown, there are some beautiful buildings there
Absolutely.
that are
Absolutely.
in a sad state of disrepair. But it's a very good question. And also the question of where was the shipyard is something I still have not had a satisfactory answer for. Plus the shoreline and the whole area has been dramatically altered through the construction of the canal and the various iterations of the Champlain Canal, including the barge canal, which probably went right through the area where several vessels, these vessels that escaped to Ticonderoga in 1776 that didn't get burned at Arnold's Bay, they ended up getting burned in Whitehall in 1777 when the British did come down and capture Fort Ticonderoga.
Right.
But unfortunately, then I think they were all dredged out when the barge canal was put in
I
there.
mean, the same can be said for Fort Anne.
Oh yeah, Fort Anne,
Another
you know,
disappointing place to go.
there has been some interesting work happening in Fort Anne around the battlefield site there, but I don't know that that's going to turn into any amazing interpretive center or anything like that. All boils down to money in the end, unfortunately. Any other questions? Yes?
Chris, when you were showing some of the overheads of where the site was, there was a dock. It looked like a dock.
Yes.
Boats on that. Where is that?
So that is, let me just back up here, see if I can. There's probably a better way for me to do this. That is the dock system for the Middlebury Sailing Club.
Oh, is it?
Yes. Which is, come on. Oh my God, sorry.
There it is.
Yeah.
There it is.
Was it visible there?
Okay.
Yeah, and here you can see it, yeah. These are all the sailing boats from the Middlebury. Which, if you come down Adams Ferry Road,
Yeah.
it takes a sharp turn to go down to the boat launch, which is way up here.
Yeah.
That's right where that.
There's a wee sail up there, and I was just curious where that was.
Yeah, they have since, they've taken off this L-shaped piece of the dock, but it's in place there now. They've been very gracious allowing us to use that dock, because, you know, we were often diving off of our platform that's moored out here, but you could just as easily get there from shore quite simply. Yes?
I was also curious, Arnold's Cove or Bay or whatever you want to call it, that's the only place in the United States that has Arnold's name on it, isn't it?
There's only one other place that I'm aware of in extreme northern Maine that's called Arnold's Pond. And that's a place where, for that invasion of Canada in 1775, Arnold was actually deployed over to go through the wilderness of Maine to get to Quebec City. But that's one that's even more remote than Arnold's Bay, and it's literally right on the Canadian border. It's within a couple miles of the Canadian border. But yeah, there's very few places that are willing to bear the name of Arnold after what transgressed after this occurred, of course. Any other questions? Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out. We really appreciate you. Please keep your eye on the scheduling. There's lots of other great talks coming this summer. But yes.
So what's going to happen to the Spitfire again?
Well, so the Spitfire,
Anything?
it depends on what kind of funding we're able to handle. But in 2026, we hope to do some preliminary excavation and documentation, recovery of maybe those exposed artifacts, and really further characterize the site. We want to take some wood samples. There are some zebra mussels present on the Spitfire, despite the fact that it's in really deep water. We want to recover those so we can test to make sure they're zebra mussels and not quagga mussels. So very preliminary things like that. And then, you know, assuming that all goes well and we're able to work safely in those depths, then we would look at probably 2027 as a much more extensive archaeological excavation there.
Very cool.
How deep
Yes.
is it, Chris?
How deep? I can't tell you. It's forbidden. It's beyond recreational dive limits, which are 135 feet.
Right.
So
Come on, you
it's
can
deep. It's plenty deep.
What happened to the Washington and the British fleet?
Well, so what happened to the Washington is they all went back up to Canada. Ultimately, most of those boats ended up back at Fort St. John where they rotted and sank, including the Washington. But there's very poor documentation of that. The last time a lot of them appear in a naval inventory is about 1790, when they're all noted as being rotten and some sunk at their moorings.
Yeah.
They are currently excavating a wreck at Fort St. John that has some resemblance to the Congress. So could be the Washington. Would be pretty remarkable if we went from having 0 archaeological examples of rogue galleys to 2 in the same in the same decade. But we'll see. Could be. There's also French and Indian War wrecks there. There's War of 1812 wrecks there. There's all kinds of vessels. That's not good.
Very cool.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Much appreciated. Have a safe drive home.